Welcome to lecture 14 of the day trading model. This lecture is about money management. Money management is a very important topic because without proper money management, you can have the best self-control in the world, you can have the best technical edge in the world. If you're not able to capitalize on that properly by risking enough or decreasing risk when things aren't going well, you are not able to consistently make good profits from the marketplace. And therefore, money management rules have to be put in place to basically guide you through the waters of the markets. Therefore, this lecture is very important and it's going to be a rather boring one since we're only going to discuss numbers. However, when you've made it to this lecture, you have probably already watched through all of the previous lectures. Well, you should at least, because if you did not watch all of the 13 lectures prior, you have literally no point in watching this lecture because you don't have a model yet. However, if you do have your own model now, and if you do have the confidence in your own model, then this is this next step, looking at money management. General money management rules. First of all, without a model, money management is not a point of focus. Because again, like mentioned before, if you do not have a model yet, if you do not have something that you see repeat within the markets every single week or every single day, money management shouldn't be a focus for you. Your focus should be on developing that edge and developing that model. But once you have established that model, you can take a look at money management. You need to have rules for what gets done when you lose, when your idea doesn't play out. But you also need to have rules for what gets done when you win, when your idea does play out. What one can do when they lose. First of all, the first thing that someone can do is the following. They can increase the risk. And as you can see, I've literally put behind it that I think that this is dumb, I think this is stupid, because of the following. If you're increasing the risk when you're taking losses, that's a very bad behavior because this is exactly the behavior that 99.99% of all traders that fail behave in. What they do is that they take an unrequired loss, and that unrequired loss gets turned into a series of losses. And what happens when that series of losses occurs without proper money management? Instead of just taking a paper cut from the marketplace, instead of just getting hurt a little, they get destroyed because they're increasing the risk on every new position because that one loss turns into another loss and that another loss turns into another loss. And therefore, when increasing risk, if you're losing, you are behaving in a very bad manner. And I think that's the most irresponsible thing that you could do. I'm not saying that if you are in a losing streak that you won't bounce around, because of course at one point you will bounce around. However, if you're going through a process of losing consistently, increasing risk is by far the most stupid thing that one can do. The second option that one can choose to follow when losing is the following: keeping risk the same. I'm rather neutral when it comes to keeping risk the same because I don't believe it's overwhelmingly good, but I also don't think it's overwhelmingly bad when you're losing. However, it is still something that can result in a good equity curve, as we will see in a bit. And the third thing that one could do is decreasing risk. Decreasing risk is, in my opinion, very smart because it limits the amount of risk that can be taken on that next trade after taking a loss. And when we are trading, we need to make sure that we do not fall into a downward spiral when it comes to our equity curve. So in order to do so, we need to limit the amount of risk when the probabilities of our trades playing out decrease, meaning when the environment is low probable. In the first place, we shouldn't even be trading inside a low probability environment. However, if we're not aware of the low probability environment whilst trading, then decreasing the risk once we have lost in the first place is a very important thing to do because it limits the amount of risk exposure that you're continuously going to have. Let's now take a look at what one can do when they win. First of all, what someone can do when they win is decrease risk. And you might be wondering, decreasing risk, why would you decrease risk when winning? That's someone who's very conservative. That's someone who doesn't have a lot of faith and trust in their own model, in their own approach. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's just a conservative mindset when it comes to trading. Because if you understand your model and if you understand when and where your model will deliver, then decreasing risk is rather counterintuitive because it goes against what your model is telling you to do. And it also will limit you in your equity curve, because if your equity curve is being limited by the fact that you're decreasing risk every time you're winning, what occurs when, let's say, you go through a phase where your model is not as cleanly delivering? You limited yourself during the winning period, so now you gotta live up to that during the losing period as well. The second thing that one could do is keep risk the same. This is also a conservative way of trading, because if we're continuously risking the same whilst our model is presenting itself, we are limiting ourselves again in the potential ROI during that period in which we can see our model consistently appear. However, this is, in my opinion, a very good thing to do if you're completely new. Because if you are winning consistently after one another, it can be very tempting to increase the risk. However, if you do not have the experience backing you up when it comes to your model, and you're just trying it out for the first time or trying it out for the first, let's say, half a year or something, a first year, why would you put yourself in an elevated risk environment where it's you increasing the amount of risk and probably also the amount of emotional attachment to those trades? If you would just find that sweet spot of risk that you are comfortable with risking and you can consistently risk that, then that's a very good thing in my opinion. And the third thing that one could do when winning after another is increasing the risk. And this is an aggressive style of trading that can have a very high impact on your equity curve if applied correctly during the right periods of time. We will all look at this later during this lecture. Before we dive into the numbers, etc., I want to first touch on the topic of point A to point B. The reason why I want to touch on this topic is because this topic is very important, in my opinion, when it comes to understanding how we can risk equity within a market environment where we anticipate the market to move in a certain way. Meaning, where we understand the drawn liquidity and when that drawn liquidity is likely to reach. Because there will be instances in which we recognize that this is point A and this is point B. Point A being the price level where we will go long off, and point B being the price level where we would take profit. In some instances, the invalidation level of this move higher occurring is the following. It would be this price level. However, in other cases, the invalidation level of that move still being valid or still occurring would be this level. You tell me, if the market would present itself a setup right here with an entry at this price level, a stop loss at this price level, and a take profit at that price level, would you still take it, or would the RR not be worth it for you? That's something you need to think about. If the RR is not worth it for you, if you think that the equity that you are going to risk on that trade is not worth the amount of money that you could potentially make, then don't take it. However, what you need to understand is that you can recognize moves, and the RR is a variable that's likely to be changed, because in some instances the RR will be 1 to 2, in some instances the RR will be 1 to 4, in some instances the RR will be 1 to 3. Will you hold yourself to 1 RR? Will you limit the amount of trades that you can take simply because someone said that you should stick to 1 RR and trade that the rest of your life? Or would you much rather say, I'm going to look for the recognition of a move from point A to point B, from a low risk buy to an original consolidation, from a first stage of accumulation to an original consolidation, from a second stage of accumulation to an original consolidation? The answer, in my opinion, is quite clear. I think the majority of people would choose for the second answer, for the latter, simply due to the fact that it allows for more positions, and you won't even have to basically think about whether or not the RR is worth it. All you do is trade what you see. You trade the potential setups that present themselves. And in some instances, these setups will be a high RR, and in other instances, they will be rather low. But I do, however, believe that as long as the size between point A and point B is worth the move, I think that a trade is still valid. However, if the size between point A and point B is too small, then I feel like risking equity is not a smart thing to do. Keynotes. The schematics that will be shared are based on a fixed 1 to 2R return. This is by no means a capping target. Like I said, I'm a big believer in the fact that RR is a flexible thing, meaning we shouldn't subscribe to just a fixed RR if we understand that the market moves from a smart money reversal to an inertia consolidation. I do, however, believe that if we would look at every single setup from a different perspective, we can allow ourselves to basically make this RR flexible. But if there are instances in which we see that the range between point A and point B is too small, then we should likely not even consider trading that move. The percentages used for the risk and return calculations can and should be adjusted for different purposes, such as, for example, prop firm challenges, personal accounts, and algorithms. The reason why I mentioned this is because within my calculations for the examples, I have just sticked to rather simple percentages such as 1% risk, 0.5% risk, or 1.5% risk. However, if you're looking to trade, for example, a prop firm challenge or a real funded account, you might want to adjust those variables, those risk parameters, based on the amount of risk that you're allowed to take. Here we're taking a look at the conservative management, decreased risk sample size. Of course, these sample sizes are all hypothetical, they're all created by me, but what I'm doing is I'm sharing with you a perspective about risk management. So that's why we're looking at these sample sizes. As you can see, the first risk for the first trade is 0.5%. This trade turns out to be a winner. The risk for the next trade is 1% then. What I can already tell you is that the minimum amount of risk for this conservative management is 0.5% and the max amount of risk is 1%. Meaning, with the next trade, we take 1% risk. This trade turns out to be a loser. What do? We move back to 0.5% risk. The third trade with 0.5% risk turns out to be a winner. What do we do for the next trade? We go back to 1% risk. The fourth trade turns out to be a winner as well. Do we now go to 1.5% risk? No, we stick to 1% because we're conservative with our management. We're only decreasing the risk when we're losing, and the minimum amount of risk that we are willing to take is 0.5%, and the maximum amount of risk that we're willing to take is 1%. The fifth trade then turns out to be a loser. So what do? We move from 1% risk back to 0.5% risk for the next trade. The sixth trade turns out to be a loser as well. Do we now decrease the risk again? No, we stick to 0.5% risk because this is our minimum, and the remainder of the sample size speaks for itself. What I want you to take away from this sample size is that every single time that this trader loses, he divides the risk for the next position by 2, which allows him to basically decrease the potential drawdown when he's experiencing a period of drawdown. Surely, drawdown can come in one trade. However, there will also be instances in which drawdown will come across multiple trades. And by subscribing to this way of managing risk, we're able to basically limit the amount of potential drawdown during those periods. Again, the percentages used can be adjusted based on personal preference and of course the goal of the management. Sequence in risk after result of trades is crucial, meaning what we do when we win, what we do when we lose is crucial, and that should not be adjusted if we're going to look for conservative management. An example of this conservative management based on this sample size in an equity curve would look like the following. On the left right here, you can see the y-axis, and this is of course the percentage positive return, and this is a result of the y-axis minus 100. That's where you can see the return. What is very important to note is that this is of course a hypothetical example, but you can see how we have a very nice equity curve that moves up steadily. Here we can see the equity curve that comes along with the sample size provided for the conservative management. As you can see, this is a very steady equity curve in which there aren't big drops lower, but also no meteoric rises. Instead, we see simply higher lows, higher highs if we're speaking in retail terms. What we can of course see is that the percentage positive return is the number on the y-axis minus 100 for your info. What we can see is that on this curve, the moment that we begin to see consecutive wins, as you can see right here, we can see that there's a nice run higher. But the moment that we begin seeing signs of, okay, we're losing now, we decrease the amount of risk after the first loss, which allows us to create that higher low within the equity curve. If a new win comes, then we can run to a new high, to a new equity high. We're now going to take a look at conservative management, but the risk will stay the same. The risk will stay the same when losing. As you can see, for this first trade, we have a loss. The risk on this first trade was 1%. This means that the next trade we will also be risking 1%. The second trade is a winner. The next trade will be risked with 1%. The third trade is a winner, so the next trade will be risked with 1%. The fourth trade is a loser, so the next trade will be risked with 1%. And what you're of course seeing is that the risk remains static. And this is of course not a problem if your win rate is high enough. If you can anticipate that you have enough wins to cover for this 1% risk, if you know your model, if you are able to call the market consistently, if you're able to see moves consistently occur, then conservative management with the same risk works, where you're not increasing the risk, where you're not decreasing the risk. If we take a look at the schematic that follows with this sample size, you can see the following. Here we can see the corresponding equity curve for the conservative risk management, in which the risk amount stays the same. I apologize for this sudden increase right here, since the first trade was a loser, so we went below the positive mark, and I'm not that good with Excel, so I'm not too sure how to add that, but you get the point. All I'm showing to you is how an equity curve can look if proper applied. Here we can see that the first trade is a loser. The risk was 1%, so 1% gets lost. The next trade we risk another 1%, and the return is 2%. The third trade we again risk 1%, and the return is also 2%. Then the fourth trade comes along and we lose 1%, but notice how the risk is staying the same all along. And as long as you're winning enough, as long as you're taking enough profitable trades, because your model is present, because you're able to call the market consistently and you see what the market is going to do, as long as your model is presenting setups, a equity curve like this can occur with conservative risk management, in which you're not increasing the risk and in which you're also not decreasing the risk. You're simply keeping the risk the same, and it allows you to simply focus on executing. You don't have to worry about the risk being adjusted, you just execute. This is of course a very nice equity curve, it's a very nice sample size. However, this type of sample size can of course also come in a different form where there are multiple losses after one another. And if that's the case, a conservative risk management doesn't really work well, in my opinion. Because if you, for example, had 3 losses in a row, let's take a look at this right here. Let's take a look at the example between 4 and 6. So let's take a look at the fifth trade. Here we are on the fifth trade. Imagine if the fifth trade right here, so the movement from 4 to 5, wasn't profitable, but instead went downwards. Yeah. Let's say that the next trade was also a losing trade, meaning we had 3 losing trades in a row. What occurs? you will go back to break even again. So in total, you have taken 6 trades and you're back at break even now. Why? Because that moment right here between the second and third trade in which you were profitable, you didn't capitalize enough on that profitable moment. If you would have capitalized on that profitable moment in a proper sense, in a proper way, then you would have increased the amount of equity on the account, and then you would be able to handle a drawdown period of 3 trades if the risk would, for example, be decreased after that first loss. And that just shows why decreasing risk is important, in my opinion. Because the moment you go through a losing streak in which you have multiple losses in a row, the amount of drawdown that will cause because you don't change the risk is rather significant relative to the performance. And this is, of course, an example in which everything went well, in which you see a nice equity curve going higher, in which it's win, loss, win, loss, win, loss. However, this is not reality. There will be instances in which it will be loss after loss after loss, and that's when conservative management really comes to play, and that's when your mindset comes to test. And that's something you need to think about. So that's why it's important that I mention this right now within this lecture. So it's up to you to decide what you will do with that information. Here we can see a sample size for aggressive management. Aggressive management means that we are increasing the risk when we are winning. The reason why we're increasing the risk, why we're winning, is because we believe that when we're winning, we are in sync with the markets. And when we're in sync with the markets and we're able to consistently see what is likely to happen next, increasing the amount of risk for every single new position might be a good thing to do. If we take a look at the sample size, we can see that the first trade is being risked with 0.5%. The next trade get risked with 1% because that first trade was a winner. The second trade was also a winner. So the third trade get risked with 1.5% risk. However, the third trade turns out to be a loser. So we do not increase the risk or we do not keep it the same. Instead, we decrease the risk back to 1%. Why are we decreasing it? We are decreasing the risk because we're managing the risk in an aggressive manner where we're going up aggressively, but we're trying to go lower when we're losing in a rather passive way, in a rather safe way, without too much drawdown. If we then decrease the risk to 1%, we can see that the fourth trade turns out to be a loser. So the fifth trade gets taken with 0.5% risk. And here we can see a sequence of wins, where we see the first trade of this sequence of 3 wins be a winner. So after the 0.5% risk for the fifth trade, we move to the sixth trade, which gets risked with 1%. The third trade then gets risked with 1.5%, and it turns out to be a winner as well. The eighth trade turns out to be a loser, so we lose 1.5%, so the ninth trade has to be taken with 1% risk. The ninth trade turns out to be a winner, so the 10th trade gets taken with 1.5% risk. The 10th trade turns out to be a loser, and that's the end of this sample size of 10 hypothetical trades. If we take a look at the equity curve that comes along with this aggressive management, we can see the following. This aggressive management profits from the fact that we're in sync, that we're likely to know what the market is going to do for the upcoming period, and which we can see that major steps are being taken within the equity curve. We see this first run higher, and then the moment that drawdown comes, in which we lose twice in a row, the majority of the profits, or I should say all the profits, gets given back. However, the moment that we then have a run of consistently wins, in which we have 3 wins in a row, due to the aggressive management, we are able to make major moves in our equity curve. And therefore, the moment that we recognize that we're in sync, we are stepping up the amount of risk per trade. Notice that when we then take a loss, the amount of risk for the next trade has to be decreased significantly. Because if we do not and we keep the risk the same at the highest amount of 1.5%, all of the profits provided will be taken away again. And that's of course not ideal. The main takeaway from this example is that if we're in sync and we are recognizing that we're in sync, increasing the risk will allow us to catch these enormous runs higher in our equity curve. This is, however, something that only experienced traders should consider because they're able to recognize what is highly probable and what isn't. Choosing your risk management style. In order to define what risk management style suits you best, we must first define two things. First of all, we must define the purpose of the risk management. Is the purpose of the risk management to basically conservatively make gains over a month or over a year? Or is the purpose of the risk management to make gains or profit aggressively, quickly? If the goal is, of course, to stay conservative and to keep risk low, or relatively low, I should say, then we would, of course, try to divulge into a conservative risk management approach. However, if the goal is to make gains quickly and to, let's say, compete, or let's say to show off or whatever, then the focus is on an aggressive style of risk management. Secondly, the confidence in your model is very important for defining what risk management style suits you best. If the confidence in your model is low, then of course you wouldn't be out there trading with high amounts of risks, meaning you wouldn't be increasing the risk after a win because you do not have a lot of confidence in your own ability to trade. Until you are fully confident in your ability to trade, the most conservative way of trading is always the best one. Again, I'm not telling you that you should be trading at all. I'm not telling you to start live trading because that's something you decide on your own. However, I'm just providing to you general rules that I subscribe to. If I would not have confidence in my own approach, if I would not have faith in my own model, then I would never consider utilizing an aggressive style of managing risk. With that, this lecture comes to an end. I hope that you found it insightful. I hope that I was able to shed some light on the topic of risk management. Again, the examples provided within the sample size and the corresponding equity curves were based on a 1 to 2 RR. Now imagine what occurs when the RR becomes a variable and it's simply a result of you being able to recognize market moves in advance and you able to execute based on them on a demo account, of course. Imagine that for a second. Imagine the potential of your equity curve then. With the knowledge that you are getting to know, with the ability to trade, it doesn't take long to realize what else is out there to achieve. I hope that you found this lecture insightful and I look forward to speaking to you next week within the final lecture of the model series. After the model series, we will be diving into an application series in which I will be showing you live. I'm not going to do live streams, but I'm going to record my screen and my internal dialogue, my voice, from the moment I open up my charts to leaving the charts. And whatever occurs in between is going to be recorded and shared. So you'll have the ability to watch over my shoulder. I look forward to speaking to you in the next lecture. Be safe.